So my name's Wardrip-Fruin, and I'm going to talk about games. How many of you play games at all? How many of you play games every week? How many of you play games more than you read novels? More than you watch TV? Okay, it gives me a pretty good idea. Okay, I am definitely somebody who's here as an advocate for the possibility of games, but I also want to talk about some of the things that maybe we don't like to talk about. And I think one of the things that doesn't come up when we're kind of doing games boosterism is that a lot of games kind of feel the same. And I'm not sure I mean what you immediately think I mean. So, for example, an early game, whether you count it from Willie Higginbottom's version or Atari's version or whatever, is Pong or Tennis for Two. You know, this sort of very simple simulation of tennis or ping pong where a virtual ball goes back and forth and knocks into the walls and knocks into the paddles, and people can move the paddles up and down, right? And what's going on there? Well, there's things that you can move as a player, the paddles, and there's also collisions, right? There's collision detection. So the virtual ball can run into the virtual paddle and bounce off. It can run into the virtual wall and bounce off. It can go past the paddle, and when it collides with the edge of the screen, your opponent scores a point. We might say another very influential early game. Oh, this is darker than I thought it would be. So this is an image. You'll have to take my word for it. This is an image of Space War, a game that we can date more precisely to 1962 at MIT, where two players, maneuver starcraft around and fire projectiles at each other, but also are constantly being sucked inward by the force of a central star at the middle of the space. And so here we sort of add something that at least, in Pong was, if it was present at all, was very simple, right? Pong, if something hits at a certain trajectory, it bounces off another one. That's a very simple model of physics. Space War has a more complex model of physics, where things like gravity are actually being modeled. So collision, movement, physics. We might feel that Pac-Man is a very different game. I don't. If you look at what's going on in Pac-Man, well, you've got collision. You can't run into parts of the maze, and you've got movement, right? You can move the joystick like you could move the paddle, like you could move the spaceship. And if you think about more recent games, even the games that seem kind of innovative, a lot of them are basically a celebration of these same elements packaged in a new way. So if you think about something like Mirror's Edge, which is a parkour game, right, but it's basically a game of movement, collision detection, and physics. Or a game like Katamari Damacy, right? This is a game where, it's a very strange game that I recommend to all of you, right? Where you roll things around and you collect more and more of them, and you get bigger and bigger balls as you collect more and more things, until eventually you're collecting people and cars and islands and so on. And you start out with like paper clips. All right, so how should we think about this, right? How do we think about the fact that there's something similar at the heart of so much of what we often think of as a kind of diverse computer game culture? Well, genre isn't going to help, right? We usually talk about computer games in terms of genres, right? There are strategy games, there are first-person shooters, and so on. But these games are all in different genres. So that's not how we can think about this sort of deep similarity. Usually the sort of next level down of game analysis is not genre but mechanics, right? What are the things that make the game operate? What are the rules that the player experiences when they play? But again, these mechanics are really diverse from each other, right? What's being done is quite different. So, maybe it's something deeper, right? Maybe that's how we can think about this similarity. And then, as you might guess, right, I'm going to this familiar question, which for those of you who think about digital media kind of comes up again and again in different guises, which is basically, how do we think about the inside of digital media? right? You know, we kind of know from thinking about other media some way we might think about audiences. We know from other kinds of media some ways we might think about what appears on the surface, right? What's the interface? But how do we think about the inside seems really perplexing to a lot of people in sort of the digital media field, right? So some people might say, well, you know, maybe zeros and ones. Maybe, oh, this is supposed to be the cover of Sadie Plant's book, which is called Zeros and Ones, right? So maybe binary arithmetic is really central, right? Maybe if we could just get a handle on the sort of the fact that things are stored that way, maybe that would tell us something. Not many people, I think, argue that very seriously anymore. I think a lot more seriously, people argue that sort of uncompiled source code is key. That if we could just start interpreting code, maybe we would understand digital media more deeply. And SLSA has had a conference on code. Ars Electronica has had a conference on code, right? You know, this seems to be sort of one of the, currently probably still on the rise, models for how we might understand digital media. And it's a model that I'm resistant toward. And I can think of my resistance probably in a number of ways, but part of it I think is just personal, right? Like I've worked as a person in a research lab, and if you came in while I was editing some code on my screen and said, "Hey, what are you working on? What does that do?" And I said, "Oh, I'll print the code out for you, and you can read it over lunch," right? That would be a really rude answer, right? That would basically be a way of saying, like, go away. Because, well, as those of us who create code probably know all too well, one of the biggest ways to get a software project to fail is to hand it off from one programmer to another, right? Because code is not self-explaining. Code is actually often quite, obfuscated and difficult to understand and difficult to maintain, and we don't even have a good way of reading our own code after 6 months often, right? So I really think this is a confusion to think that really what we want to be getting at is the code. I think there are other models that are going to be more productive. So in my recent book, Expressive Processing, what I try to do is analyze things in terms of their operational logics, right? So sometimes I have had to resort to source code as a way of identifying the operational logics that I want to discuss. But there are lots of other places to get them from, right? That's why people write technical articles. That's why people give conference presentations. That's why people produce dissertations, is to have some sort of accurate but higher level description than the code of what the code does. And that, I think, is a good way, a good resource for trying to recognize what the logics are at work in a piece of software. So to say this a little more concretely, for me, operational logics in terms of digital media are abstract processes used by authors to communicate to audiences that can be implemented in many ways. Right, so what do I mean by in many ways? Right, so if you play a game like Pong on the Atari VCS, right, the Atari 2600 as it's also known, the first major home computer game system, the collision detection is actually implemented in hardware. The television interface adapter for the 2600 knows when it's drawing things that are touching. Whereas, let's say you're, a student being assigned to build a game in Microsoft's XNA environment. There, the collision detection is entirely implemented in software, right? It's a radically different implementation. But the logic, right, this sort of idea that is expressed through an algorithm that virtual objects can touch is the same. And I would argue, perhaps controversially, that nearly all computer games today are about this. They're about virtual objects touching. Whether those virtual objects are projectiles or characters and platforms or whatever. Now, the usual objection I get to that sort of assertion is, well, aren't games also really about their story? And certainly games often have interesting stories, right? So I don't know, how many of you have played Prince of Persia: Sands of Time? Okay, so a couple. Please do before the Jake Gyllenhaal movie comes out this summer, right? I mean, he may be a very talented actor. He's not Persian. Anyway, so and that just sort of makes me less hopeful than I should be. Anyway, so this does have a quite interesting story about inevitability, and in many ways about the form of the game and the mechanics of the game. But the structure of the game is this, right? So there are all these sort of areas of play, platforming play, combat play, and then there are the moments in between where fiction takes place, right? And play and fiction kind of alternate. I would argue that games are really about what you do when you're playing them. And what you do when you play Prince of Persia is not the story, right? Prince of Persia is about platforms and time mechanics and so on. And that's why it tells an appropriate story for what it's about, but it's not really about its story. And I would say the same is true of the Half-Life series, the Uncharted series, of many games that are sort of lauded for their storytelling. They have this structure where you sort of experience a story when you're not playing, and then other times when you're playing, it's not a story. And actually, I might even argue this for the current state of role-playing games, which are the closest to trying to, say, use dialogue as a game mechanic. And if you're interested in my argument about current role-playing games, I'm actually going to be giving that on Wednesday, I think at noon. So stick around afterwards and maybe we can figure out exactly where. Anyway, or maybe actually searching online might be a better way. All right, so let's say that we have these logics, right, of collision detection and movement and so on. And I say, they're basically about representing objects and objects running into each other, and that's what most games are about. Well, couldn't we just use those logics to represent something else, right? If this is an algorithm that's used to represent an idea, what if we repurpose those algorithmic representations for some other purpose? So I don't know how many of you have played Jason Rohr's Passage. Okay, so for everyone but him, I am now going to give you spoilers for the game. And if you are someone who likes to avoid spoilers, I guess you can kind of close your ears and eyes for a moment. So Passage very deliberately is trying to take these well-known game logics and use them for some other purpose, and has this kind of 8-bit representational style that it uses to kind of foreground how sort of classic its underlying software system is. So you play this character, and you can go and sort of explore the world, and you can go through these passageways, and you can, get things that look like the typical 8-bit rewards, right? I discover this treasure chest, and there's this sort of explosion of blue, and a star comes out, and clearly I'm doing something right. You can also do this, right? You can sort of keep going that way instead of going down, and you can get together with your love interest, right, who's also 8-bit, and the two of you can travel the world together. But interestingly, the two of you can't go down many of the passages that one of you could alone, right? And this is when you start to get the hint that the game is maybe about something other than what it seems to be about, right? That it's trying to use collision detection to represent something else. So you and your partner go through the parts of the world that you can reach as a pair, and you start to notice that, as you make these movements, you are transforming, right? So here's a shot of sort of a moment of transformation. And that over time, as you play the game, your little 8-bit sprites are becoming sort of not only sort of further along the screen to the right, they're also unmistakably older, even though they're only 8-bit. And so you start passing through these different parts of the world. You keep transforming. You keep getting older. And then the sort of best-known moment of the game is as you keep exploring the world, this happens, right? One of you becomes a tombstone. And then you have a lot more places you can go again. But I think, most people end up playing the way that I did, and they just sort of go forward into this relatively empty checkerboard area until this happens. And that's the end of the game, right? So clearly, Rohr is trying to use this sort of traditional movement collision detection set of logics to express something about life. And it's kind of a neat trick. but I'm pretty convinced it's not the beginning of a new genre, right? It could be that we would actually redefine these logics. And we would say, collision detection no longer means virtual objects can touch. Collision detection means some pathways in life are open to you and others not, depending on the shape of your player character, right? But even Rohrer has basically started moving away from this, right? So like his new game is Sleep is Death, which is also a storytelling game, but a storytelling game that it's only for 2 players. And it basically is using human intelligence to try to allow a lot more operations than you can get out of this sort of limited palette that he implements in his early games. So sort of my question, and the question that I want to use the next 10 minutes trying to answer is, can we go further, right? And I think we can go further in a couple of ways. One way, which is what gets me billed as an artist and a scholar, is that I create things like this. So this is an excerpt from a video about a piece I did with collaborators, first at Brown University, and then there was an iteration at UC San Diego, and there's been some installation versions of it. And it starts with 3 short fictions, very short fictions, each the size of an 8x8 wall when they're projected, that are each about memory as a virtual experience. And then the player starts out by reading these texts, and then the texts begin to come loose. And you can just watch them come loose, but you can also start hitting them back with your hand. And as you hit them back with your hand, often they go back to where they came from, but sometimes they go back where other words used to be. And sometimes they break apart if you hit them too hard, or if there's not a good space in the wall for them to go to. And what happens is you can play more and more actively. And the more actively you play, the longer the kind of memory texts stay in place, but also the more distorted and intermixed they become. And eventually, when too many words are off the wall at once, then all the rest of them pull loose and collapse. And that's the end of the experience, right? Like this. And so what this is essentially doing is using that very familiar game mechanic, right? Movement and collision detection, but using the movement and collision detection to try to enact an activity that is thematically related to what is going on in the textual material, right? So we're not actually taking action in the fictional world. Instead, what we're doing is we're doing some other action as readers and players that is related to the fictional world. And I think that's one way of going further, right, is that we can use these traditional gameplay mechanics even more radically than someone like Rohrer tries to use them. But I think there's still this question about, what about playing with people, right? What if we were trying to make games about people where you actually played with the people in the fictional world? And this is, of course, the elephant in the room, right, is Will Wright's The Sims. This is one of the best-selling games of all time. And it's certainly not a game about collision detection, right? It's a game about something else. And I think actually looking carefully at what its something else is can tell us a lot about sort of what possibility space might be worth exploring as we think about games about people. All right, so this is both one of the most culturally influential and one of the most commercially successful games of all time. And yet, unlike games like, say, Doom, that are also very commercially and culturally important, there have been basically no knockoffs. There's been no sort of genre formed outside of the efforts of the Sims team at Maxis/EA. And why that is also, I think, another interesting question, right? Okay, so what's going on in The Sims? For those of you who haven't played, basically we control the home lives of simulated people in the suburban US. Right? So when they go to work, they disappear. Then we see them again when they come home. And we have to make sure we get them to work on time, but it's just about home life. And, there are expansions where you do things like go out on a date. There are expansions where you can live in an urban environment instead of a suburban one. But it's about home life and social life. It's not about work life or political life or anything else, right? There are many, many possible actions in The Sims, right? There are lots of things you can do. You can wash the sink. You can make dishes. You can take a shower. You can urinate, right? I mean, there are lots and lots of things you can do, and every expansion pack gives you more things you can do, right? When you get an expansion pack that has a chessboard in it, suddenly all your Sims know how to play chess. The reason they know how to play chess is because all the animations and all the other behaviors in terms of how the simulated world is affected are bundled up with each object, right? So each object is kind of a smart object that advertises to Sims, I can do these things for you. And if you take this action, this is the animation you should use, and so on. So this is a shot of the Edith editor that's actually used for creating objects. And here you can see something that's particularly important, which is how the particular action that's being edited affects the basic needs meters of the Sims, right? So you can take actions that do things like increase skills or improve jobs or change social relations with other Sims, but most of the actions, whatever else they do, and most of them maybe only address the needs meters. So basically, as you come to play The Sims, what you come to understand is that a simulated person, especially Sims 1, but I would argue it's the same up through Sims 3, a simulated person is a set of meters. And basically what you're trying to do in life is keep these meters from degrading too far, right? If you get to the point where, your bladder is about to burst, or if you get to the point where, you are about to fall asleep on your feet or whatever, you are losing. Of course, there is a genre of play that's just about torturing your Sims, but we'll leave that aside for now. Locking them in a room and setting it on fire, or locking them in a room that just has no urinal or whatever. What are you doing when you play The Sims? Basically, you're fighting against time to meet needs and get to your job, right? So, the carpool is going to come in about an hour. Oh, but I haven't showered, I haven't dressed, I haven't eaten, I haven't cleaned the house, I haven't made the bed, starting to sound really familiar, actually. There's this sort of tension where more expensive objects satisfy needs better, right? A better refrigerator keeps food fresher longer and the food is more satisfying. But it also requires more money to maintain. You're paying more bills to have the house that will hold all these objects and so on. And so basically the result for most players, certainly for me, I think, is that basically The Sims is a game about never having enough time, money, or space, right? And you're constantly trading off, right? So what are the logics of The Sims, right? If The Sims is not about movement and collision detection, I would actually argue that the logics of The Sims are also very familiar to us, right? For those of you who've played Oregon Trail, or those of you who've played Civilization, or those of you who've played Will Wright's earlier game, SimCity, right? These are the logics, basically, of resource allocation and random events, right? So there are sources, sinks, transformations, right? I can choose to turn my Sim's time into relief for my Sim's bladder. But it is not that different from choosing to turn part of my population to harvesting grain in Civilization, right? These are very familiar logics. These are not invented for The Sims. And actually, that is probably why we don't see a genre emerging around The Sims, I would argue, is that basically it's like Jason Bohr's Passage. It's kind of a one-off. It kind of says, hey, you could use those logics that were designed for something else and you could actually use them to represent human life. But those logics were never designed to represent human life, and there's kind of one trick to how to do it. And I would say that also probably tells us why, at least for me, a particular story is the best Sim story. So this is there's a story of this gnome who used to have a very sort of loving owner, and then the owner died, and he was being really abused by the owner's brother, but he couldn't reach the phone to call for help. So he went into the brother's bathroom while the brother was taking a shower and pushed the television in, igniting a conflagration. And now the brother is also a lawn ornament, like the gnome. But that's not the best Sims story, right? That's just sort of the kind of story you usually see out of The Sims, which is basically the audience for the game setting up situations and taking pictures of them, rather than the game actually playing itself according to its own logics. Now, I'm actually talking about Alice and Kev. How many of you have heard of this? A few. Okay. So Alice and Kev is a story of two Sims in The Sims 3. Kev, who has the traits of being, I think, insane and inappropriate and something else, and his daughter Alice, who is unlucky, and I forget what her other traits are, and they're homeless, right? This is a picture of them living on park benches. And as much as possible, the person who kind of posted this story online said that he was just letting the Sims play themselves. They can go in a kind of autonomous mode according to the logic of the game. Right? So the story involves a lot of, like, you know, them sleeping in places that belong to other people, and these other people getting kind of concerned and upset, of Alice eventually getting old enough to get a job, and using a good chunk of her income, not for financial security, but to send off to charity. And basically, it's a story about resources, right? When The Sims tells its own story, when it tells a satisfying story, it's a story about resources, about not having enough resources, because the internal logics of The Sims are entirely organized around resources. So what if we wanted to invent new logics? And this is kind of the home stretch here, although I think I'm starting to be over time, right? Can I take a couple extra minutes? Sure. Yeah, okay, great. So some of you may know Michael Mateas and Andrew Stern's Façade project. It starts out where you come to visit the home of these two despicable yuppies who you went to college with and introduced, who are now married, and their marriage is going to fall apart horribly before your eyes, but differently, depending on how you interact. And there were a lot of structures kind of built for Façade. So there's this drama manager that kind of tries to sequence the action to have this neo-Aristotelian arc. There are these sequencing beats that cause the characters to sort of do little interactive bits with you, the interactor, and then recover when you bring up other things and so on. But there's a design lesson that actually came out of this, which is that a powerful way of making games about people is to create what Mateas and Stern called social games. So, for example, in the beginning of the Façade, they're trying to make you play an affinity game, which is kind of a zero-sum, trying to force you to take sides between them. Later on, they're playing this therapy game, where you're supposed to be trying to help them come to sort of greater self-revelation about themselves. And this idea of social games is something that was not explicitly algorithmically represented in Façade. It's almost as though you had a platforming game, but you pasted the collision detection code into every single platform that they could run into, right? It's kind of hand-authored all the way through is the way that these social games were represented. So question is sort of how would you move this to an explicit algorithmic representation? So one approach might be The Sims 3, right? It has these social situations. So when a house guest is over, everyone behaves differently. Then you do things that are different than you would do in your own house. You do different things than you would do with members of your own household. But the actions are really atomic. There's no connections and series of actions. There's no history that goes on, right? You know, no one ever says that time when you came over to my house and ate the lasagna that was mine, right? Because the history only exists as meters, and you can't refer to a history in any sort of meaningful way that only exists as meters. So the question is, can we combine widely varying play with a fully realized human situation? And especially, can we do this both immediately, moment by moment, and over time? So actually, we're doing an experiment right now in an unannounced game that we're calling the Prom, which has emo people, sort of AV club people, and goth people who are at a high school together. And you can do things like view the state of their social network, right? So in this case, Edward and Karen, like your level objective in this sort of social puzzle would be to get them to date, but that turns out to be impossible because Robert, who's good friends with Edward, hates Karen, and there are a lot of things that you could do to kind of try to change the social situation to make it possible, right? So you could make it so that, you know, these two just like each other better, or you could make it so these two like each other less, and so on. And you know, in the sort of prototype version that you're seeing images of here, we don't do any sort of like facial animation, but maybe that's appropriate because like if you're emo enough, you should be sad even when you're admitting that you like someone a lot. So this is again another collaboration with a big group of people. And so, in essence, the structure of this game is that the characters play exaggerated social games. The design of these games is actually inspired both by sort of dramaturgical analysis, which is an old vein of social science work, and fiction, sort of humanistic and writing-centric evaluation of social games. And what these games exist to do is change social state, and then they chain together, right? So somebody asks someone out, well, maybe that results in flirting, and flirting can chain to other things, or maybe it results in a compliment that can chain to other things. And then these particular parts of the social games get filled out with things from the social facts database. So in this case, we could say that reads Dostoevsky, and in the world of this high school, that is lame, right? So that's part of the social facts database. And then games also create history and reveal history. So part of what happens as you play this game is that not only are things recorded about how the social games play out that can then be connected to future social games, but also you reveal things about the characters, who they are, how they became in the situations they're in as you play, because the game starts with this database already pretty well populated. So there are many possible paths through social configurations to a given goal, and yet the social interactions are kind of fully and concretely realized. And this is just an experiment, right? This is just the sort of thing that we do in our group, is we try to imagine how you could create a new game, and then maybe potentially a new genre. So the conclusion of my talk is that I think we can make games that are really about people, and we can really try to understand games that are about people, but it will require computer scientists, artists, and humanists working together. Thank you.